In 1986, in a 24-hour period, one man took the lives of 5 women and children. But he didn't stop there. Tonight, we'll examine how Daniel Lee Siebert went from a tortured childhood to drugs and underage prostitution and eventually serial killer. How many more victims were there? Let's find out this week on Project Strangeville. On June 17, 1954, in Mattoon, Illinois, evil was born into our world. Daniel Lee Siebert was the son of Erwin and Dorothy Siebert. His early years were extremely difficult. His father, Erwin, was emotionally detached from Daniel. He had a violent nature and would often subject Daniel and his mother to psychological and physical abuse. His father had no boundaries and for more than a decade would commit the most unthinkable atrocities upon Daniel in a way no parent or person should. With his childhood innocence taken from him, Daniel would spend the majority of his time hiding from his father and taking refuge in the one thing that would help him to escape his nightmare. Daniel was an artist. For hours, he would hide in his room with his sketch pad and pencils. He would create new worlds and realities he could escape to, if only for a short while. Daniel's artistic taste would grow darker as he grew older. I'll present some of his artwork at the end of the video, but due to the graphic nature of the art, I'm only able to show a few images, but I will let you know where I sourced them from, so if you want to see the rest of his collection, you're welcome to do so. He was a small child, living his life in solitude, pain, and constant fear. But all of this was about to change. One evening, his father returned home from work full of rage and immediately sought out Daniel. Tension had been brewing for days prior to this moment and had finally reached its boiling point. He quickly located 13-year-old Daniel and started beating on him. Daniel's mother quickly jumped in to stop the abuse and protect her son. But this only angered his father more, and he turned his focus from Daniel to his mother. Daniel was a few months from 14 by this time, and he was growing really tired of the abuse. Something snapped in him at that moment, and perhaps it was the intense fear he once had was replaced by anger, or maybe it was his instinct just to protect his mother, but regardless of what it was, for the first time in his life, he actually fought back, and this would be the turning point for Daniel. No longer able to tolerate the abuse, Daniel's mother filed for divorce, and in May of 1968, the divorce was finalized and she retained custody of Daniel. Daniel was relieved he would no longer have to suffer his father's wrath and would now have a chance to salvage what was left of his childhood. For the first time, he felt a sense of hope. But this hope would be short-lived as the walls would soon come crashing down around him. Daniel was looking forward to some peace and quiet, but his mother started dating immediately. In the late 60s, most women were homemakers and hadn't started really to enter the workforce, so she needed to find a provider. It wasn't long after the divorce that his mother started dating. She would often bring different men into the house until later the same year she divorced, she married again. The following year, his mother and stepfather welcomed a new baby boy into the home. This was the tipping point for Daniel. Daniel's descent started with skipping class and then school altogether. He attracted the attention of local law enforcement with petty, non-violent crimes and was eventually caught stealing from his family members. Due to his truancy and petty crimes, Daniel landed in a youth home operated by the Illinois Department of Corrections. Not one for authority, Daniel escaped from the youth home in 1971. Only 17 years old at the time, he was now on his own. But he would quickly learn his newfound freedom came at a cost. Daniel needed money, and because he was on the run, he couldn't go home. He became desperate and turned to prostitution and drugs. Daniel's newfound freedom wouldn't last, and before long, he was captured and returned to juvenile detention. But this time, he was sent to the Illinois Youth Center. The following year, Daniel turned 18 and was now free from the bonds of the law. Free from the father that had never wanted him and abused him for more than a decade, and free from his mother who had moved on with her new family. Daniel had been given a fresh start, a chance to turn his life around and make something good out of himself. And after some soul searching, he decided what he needed was structure. He would find this in the Marines. Criminologist Elizabeth Yardley studied Daniel's case, and she believes that the Marines represented a typical alpha male, the true American hero, and that Daniel wanted to live up to that persona. But ultimately, he was never one for authority, and structure and the culture of the military was just too much for him. His time as a Marine was short-lived. He quickly found out that he wasn't built for military life, and within 12 months, he was dishonorably discharged for going AWOL. With no family to return home to, he decided to head for California. He would need money to get to the West Coast, so he would use his art skills painting signs and murals for local businesses along the way. In 1972, Daniel finally reached Los Angeles and would call it home for the next handful of years. During that time, he would father 2 children, a boy and a girl. Becoming a father was too much stress for Daniel. He wasn't fit to be a parent, and he knew it, so once again, he turned to drugs and started attracting the attention of the police with a list of possession along with violent assault and battery charges. His son is Damian Siebert and is serving time in California for forcing himself upon a minor over the age of 14. I didn't find any information on his mother other than she was African American, and there isn't any public information on his daughter that I could find at all. The pressure from the police is too much, so Daniel decides to leave LA in 1978 and heads for Las Vegas. Not long after arriving in Vegas, Daniel entered a relationship with another man. One night, the two were arguing when Daniel, in a fit of rage, killed his lover. He was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 10 years in prison. After a couple years of good behavior, Daniel managed to get himself on a work release program in December of 1981. Daniel hated authority, so he used his newfound freedom to escape. He secured a gun, kidnapped a woman, and stole her car. Fearing for her life and desperate to get away from Daniel, she jumped from the moving car as it was traveling 55 miles per hour over the Golden Gate Bridge. The following day, Daniel was captured in Oakland and returned to Nevada State Prison. An additional year was added to his sentence, making the new total now 11 years. However, in 1985, after serving just 6 years, he was granted parole with the provision that he would return to court later that year for the kidnapping and stolen car charges he acquired during his escape. Daniel never showed up for court, but instead headed to Tucson, Arizona, then decided to head east. Along the way, he met Donald Hendren while hitchhiking and introduced himself as Daniel Spence. He introduced himself to Donald as Daniel Spence. It was a long drive and the two spent most of it talking. Daniel was very charismatic and impressed Donald so much that he offered Daniel a volunteer position at the Alabama Institute for the Deaf and Blind. They made it as far as Jackson, Mississippi, and parted ways. Daniel stayed in Jackson for a few days contemplating Donald's offer and decided to head to Talladega. 11 days after Donald returned home, he received a call from Daniel letting him know that he was in town and interested in working at the school. Donald secured a position for Daniel, and the two stayed on school campus for about 2 weeks until they secured an apartment that the two would share. The school was somewhat of its own community. The faculty and the students were very close and accepted Daniel into their hearts and their homes. It wouldn't take long, and Daniel would find love. Sherry Weathers was a 24-year-old single mother and a student at the school, but there was a problem. Faculty was not permitted to date students, and even though Daniel was a volunteer, he was still considered faculty. Donald did not approve of their romance, which put a strain on their friendship, resulting in Donald moving out the following month. On February 19, 1986, Donald met Daniel at the apartment to gather the rest of his things and make arrangements to pick Daniel up the next morning for work. Once Donald left, Daniel walked to his friend Stephen Laney's apartment to join him and his girlfriend Linda Odom for lunch. Stephen had to leave lunch early to pick up his car, so Daniel and Linda stayed behind and talked a bit. After lunch, Daniel made his way to Sherry's at the Sunrise Apartments, a complex for people with disabilities. The following night, on February 20th around 8 p.m., Daniel, Sherry, and Linda Jarman went to the local convenience store to buy some beer for the card game they were planning. Linda Jarman, a single mother, is a friend and neighbor of Sherry's. Linda was also deaf and taught at the E.H. Gentry School, which is part of the Alabama Institute for the Deaf and Blind where Sherry attends. Later that night, Daniel and Sherry would get into an argument. Angry and upset, Daniel left Sherry's apartment and walked to Linda Jarman's and asked to sleep on her couch. A few days would pass, and Sherry's teachers and friends from school hadn't seen or heard from her and were growing concerned. Wanda Hundley, a social worker at Sherry's school, and a few of Sherry's friends decided to take a drive over to Sherry's apartment for a welfare check. Management helped them gain entry to the apartment, and when they entered, there was an overwhelming smell of decay, and they knew something wasn't right. Afraid of what they might find, they immediately left the apartment and called the police. Daniel strangled the entire family to death and left an artistic message of sorts. The police questioned neighbors and locked down the scene. A few hours into their investigation, they receive a call that a teacher is also missing. Linda Jarman, Sherry's friend and neighbor, hasn't been seen or heard from in days. Suspicious the two events may be related, the detectives walk to Linda's apartment to perform a welfare check. There's no answer at the door, so they gain entry and find her strangled to death as well. Her car and VCR are also missing. The school informed the detectives that Daniel Spence, a faculty member and Sherry's boyfriend, hasn't shown up for work in days either. The police secure fingerprints from both crime scenes and run them through their database. The database gets a hit. The prints belong to Daniel Lee Siebert. They learn that Daniel was convicted of manslaughter in Las Vegas and wanted in San Francisco for first-degree assault charges. The police immediately realized that Daniel Spence was actually Daniel Lee Siebert. A nationwide alert was immediately dispatched for Daniel and Linda's 1973 yellow Buick. Police make their way to Daniel's apartment and knock on the door. Daniel doesn't answer, but his friend, Stephen Laney, hears the knock from his apartment and comes out to see what's going on. The detectives explain that they're looking for Daniel and ask if Stephen knows where he is. Stephen explains that he hasn't seen Daniel and that his girlfriend, Linda Odom, has been missing for a few days as well. The police ask if Linda knew Daniel. Stephen tells them that both he and Linda are friends with Daniel. The police explain why they're there looking for Daniel and instruct Stephen to go to the station and file a report on his missing girlfriend immediately. The police gain entry into Daniel's apartment and don't find anything that could help them immediately, but do find a map that has a number of X's and O's marked on it. Meanwhile, 350 miles north, in Elizabethtown, Kentucky, Linda's car is found on the side of the road with a flat tire. Elizabethtown police run the plates, and the car comes back stolen. They contact Talladega Police Department, and the detectives race north to Kentucky. Once they arrive, they search the car for evidence and find a makeshift campsite nearby. Inside the campsite, they find identification documents for Sherry Weathers and her two sons, Chad and Joseph. Linda Jarman's ID is also present, along with an address book, women's cosmetics, numerous photos and drawings of the Weathers family, and other women. With the police hot on his trail, Daniel leaves Kentucky and heads east to Atlantic City, New Jersey. He arrives in Atlantic City low on cash, so he's on the prowl for his next victim. He notices Beatrice McDougal setting up a banquet room at Caesars Hotel and Casino. Beatrice worked part-time as a tour guide and was preparing the room for when her guests returned from sightseeing and gambling. Realizing she was alone, Daniel entered the room and closed the door. He stabbed her twice in the stomach and then strangled her, taking what little money she had, and once again, Daniel was on the run. Approximately 2 weeks pass, and detectives in Talladega are still looking for him when they receive a call. Skeletal remains have been found in a cemetery in Talladega County. Detectives learn that the remains belong to Linda Odom. Detectives determined that Daniel must have killed Linda Odom on February 19th 1986, making her his first victim. Linda Odom would bring the total to 5 lives he had taken in a 24-hour period, and the detectives were no closer to finding him. By this time, Daniel, still in New Jersey, had run out of money he had stolen from Beatrice and knew he needed to get out of town. He assaulted another woman and robs her, but this time, he's caught in the process. Police arrest him and he identifies himself as Chad Weathers. He hands the police the stolen security card belonging to Sherry's 5-year-old son. He was sentenced to 61 days and released in June of 1986. As soon as he's released, he steals another car and leaves New Jersey, but doesn't get very far. He's pulled over in New Kent County, just outside of Richmond, Virginia. In the trunk, they find an assortment of ropes, knives, women's clothing, and belongings. He's arrested for car theft, but this time, he presents the ID of Joey Weathers, the youngest of Sherry Weathers' sons. Daniel managed to post bond and immediately headed to Baltimore, Maryland. In August of 1986, while on the run in Baltimore, he assaulted another woman but managed to evade capture and headed west, stopping in Nashville, Tennessee. It's now been 6 months that Daniel has been on the run from the law when the Talladega detectives get a hit. One of Daniel's ex-girlfriends from Las Vegas contacted the detectives and let them know Daniel had contacted her. Daniel wouldn't tell her where he was, but he did tell her what time it was by him, and she could hear a terrible thunderstorm in the background. The police immediately contacted the National Weather Service to find where any severe storms would be in the time zone he had called from. As luck would have it, there was only one storm in that area. The police were able to trace his call to a phone booth outside of a convenience store and restaurant in Hurricane Mills, Tennessee, just outside of Nashville. The detectives jumped in their car and raced from Talladega to Hurricane Mills. They arrived late that night and spoke with the owner of the store. The owner explained that he had hired Daniel to paint some signs for him and that Daniel would be back in the morning to pick up his pay. The following morning, police were waiting at the restaurant and arrested Daniel when he arrived. They returned to Talladega and began to question him, and quickly learned that there were many more victims that they weren't aware of. The following segment will detail the events that took place between February 19th and February 20th. Some of the details may be too disturbing for some, so it's here that I'm going to recommend viewer discretion. The morning he started his killing spree in Talladega, Donald Hendren was at Daniel's apartment retrieving the remainder of his belongings. Once Donald left, Daniel made his way to Stephen Laney's apartment to have lunch with Stephen and his girlfriend, Linda Odom. Stephen had to leave early to pick up his car, so Daniel and Linda finished lunch and continued talking. During that conversation, Linda said something that deeply angered Daniel, so he strangled her. He then took her body to his apartment and later that night placed it in a shallow grave at the cemetery where her remains were eventually found. He would later confess that he killed her because he felt she was being racist. When Daniel was disposing of Linda, just before putting her into the ground, he started punching her. Criminologist Elizabeth Yardley believes that he did this to enhance his sense of control over her, and that he felt rage from the way he viewed the community. It was an open and loving and inclusive community, and he felt as though he was entitled to that when he was younger, and that they didn't deserve what they had. Later that evening, Daniel went to Sherry's apartment to play cards with Sherry and her friend Linda. During the game, the trio had run out of beer, so Daniel borrowed Linda's car to go buy more. Later that night, after returning from purchasing the beer, Linda had gone home and Sherry and Daniel began arguing. The details of the argument are not clear, but it is what caused him to strangle Sherry while her boys were asleep in their beds. He then went into the boys' room and one by one woke them from their sleep and strangled them. Daniel woke up the children one by one and took them to their mother. He wanted them to know what was about to happen and for them to feel the fear. He then placed the boys' bodies atop of Sherry's in the form of a cross. When asked why he killed Sherry Weathers and her 2 boys, he said he killed Sherry because she was deaf and would never amount to anything. His reasoning for killing the boys was because now that their mother was dead, they would never amount to anything either. After killing Sherry and her 2 boys, he walked to Linda Jarman's apartment and explained that he had just gotten into an argument with Sherry and asked if he could stay on her couch that night. She invited him in, and after some small chat, Linda went to bed. Daniel waited for her to fall asleep, entered her room, strangled her, and stole her VCR and car. When Daniel snuck into her room, he used her own sock to strangle her. Then he stole her VCR, as they were worth money back then, and then he took her car. When detectives questioned him about the map they had found in his apartment that contained a number of X's and O's marked on it, Daniel explained that anywhere an X was marked was a robbery. Anything with an X with a circle around it meant he had killed someone. In total, Daniel admitted to 13 murders, which included Beatrice McDougal from Atlantic City, New Jersey, but police could only tie him to 10 at the time. Daniel received the death penalty twice for the murders of Sherry, Chad, and Joey Weathers, Linda Jarman, and Linda Odom. When asked if he had anything to say, he said, "Sherry Ann didn't have anything to say. Chad didn't have anything to say. Joey didn't have anything to say. I don't have anything to say." In August of 1987, Daniel was moved to death row. Over the next 21 years, he would spend his time appealing his sentence, drawing and writing letters until April 22nd of 2008, when he would die of pancreatic cancer while awaiting his execution. So even though Daniel didn't die from lethal injection, justice was still served. He's no longer roaming this earth. So, as promised before, I'm about to show you a couple pictures from Daniel's art collection. I'm also going to list where I got these from so you can see the rest of the collection if you want to. But before I do, if you liked what you saw, please give us a like and subscribe. It really helps with the algorithm. Thanks for watching, and here's the pictures.